Good evening, Right Direction. My name is Dr. Michelle Josie, and I'm an epidemiologist.
And I am Dr. Tisha Felder. I'm a researcher and associate professor at the University of South Carolina. Go Gamecocks!
And tonight we will serve as a moderator for our COVID Townhall 3.0, Kids, Parents, and the Pandemic. Tonight's town hall has been organized by RDCI's Healthcare Ministry, and our panelists will discuss from both a natural and supernatural perspective on such topics as child vaccinations, the impact of the pandemic on mental health, and long-haul COVID. Tonight's discussion will be led by a panel of individuals who are health professionals, pastors, parents, and members of RDCI. We are so glad to have each of you tonight and our panelists as well. If you please, starting with Dr. Wise, introduce yourself briefly and let us know the perspectives you bring tonight to tonight's discussion.
Well, good evening. My name is Stephanie Wise. I'm a pharmacist, and I've been with RDCI for 15, 16 years now. And I will be answering some questions regarding COVID vaccination.
Hello, I am Pastor Katie Brave. I am campus pastor at Right Direction. My husband and I, Right Direction Orangeburg campus. I am also a licensed professional counselor. So I will be bringing a perspective from mental health, and I have been a member of RDCI since August of 2002.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Damon Daniels. I'm a family physician here in Columbia, South Carolina. I've been a member for a long time, 20 years, 20 years here. And so it's a privilege to be here tonight. I'm going to be talking about long-haul COVID, as well as answering some of the live questions.
Good evening, Right Direction. My name is Chandler Bailey. I serve here as youth pastor since 2013. I'll be bringing a point of view of adolescent research when it comes to spiritual warfare and God's plan for our teenagers during these times.
Y'all, let's clap for this distinguished panel we have tonight. So the purpose of a town hall is to ask questions. So we have been trying to gather questions in advance of tonight, but we're also going to take questions during the panel discussion. So if one of our panelists says something or a question pops in your head that you've been having a conversation with somebody at work or in your family, our ushers, for those of you who are here in the sanctuary, the ushers have note cards. So if you just raise your hand, they'll give you a note card and get those questions to us so we can answer those questions during the live Q&A. For those of you who are joining us by streaming, we are going to have two things going on online. So you can post your questions in the comments on YouTube and Facebook. We do have some healthcare team members who will try to troubleshoot as many questions as they can themselves online. For those questions that they feel should be more appropriately answered by those who are on the panel, they're going to send those questions to us, and we're going to do our best to address them. Of course, if we get a lot of questions, we're going to do our best to answer what we can, so we appreciate your understanding in advance if we are not able to answer your question live. So, how many of us are tired of this pandemic? Okay, how many of us felt like in March 2020, things were going to be shut down just for a little while, and then we were going to go back to normal? So now we are in 2022, and we're having our third COVID Town Hall. So just to kind of get this panel discussion started, we're going to have Dr. Josie kind of set the stage for us. She's going to present about what a pandemic is, kind of what the natural progression of a pandemic is, to give us some context as to where we are now, and then we will lead right into the panel discussion.
Alrighty. I will not be before you long. So we can cue up the slides. We're going to talk about the natural progression of pandemics. And so while those are getting ready, so as human civilization has, progressed and moved on, so did infectious diseases. So the populations of people grew, but so did the proximity to each other as well as to animals. And so when we pair that with poor sanitation, which is still a matter in certain parts of the world, and poor nutrition, it creates a breeding ground for diseases. Then, on top of all of that, our worlds became more connected due to travel, trade, and also wars, right? So thus leading to global pandemics because of how connected our worlds are now. So we can go on to the next slide. So a pandemic is the Greek word pandemos, which means all people. It's an event in which disease spreads across several countries and affects a large number of people. And so we want to talk about the difference between endemic and pandemic because maybe you don't know the difference. You can go to the next slide. So the endemic is when it first started. It was in a central, isolated town or city or just a small country. But then that's when it was found in Wuhan, China. But now if you look at the lower picture, we see that it's worldwide. So it starts in a small population, and then through all those avenues that I mentioned earlier, it finds itself around the world. Alrighty. So next we're going to talk about the phases of a pandemic. And so you have phases 1 through 3, and then we have post-pandemic, which is where we want to be. So the first phases is when we think about COVID. So this was updated by the World Health Organization in 2005 for influenza, but we can see the parallels for COVID-19. So it started, COVID-19 started with bats and before it began to infect the human population. So that's in that phase 1 through 3. And then moving on to phase 4, there was a community level outbreak. So in Wuhan, China, there were patients hospitalized for pneumonia. Well, at least they thought it was pneumonia, but it was still isolated in that small population. And then moving on from phase 4, before that, I say that. Phase 4 is when the risk of a pandemic is there, but it's not a definite thing if you do things right. So the risk of spreading is there, but if things are played right and things are monitored well, it could possibly stay isolated. And then you move on to phase 5, which is a strong warning. All right, phase 5 is when the spread of the virus is in at least 2 countries in a single region. You can go to the next slide. So within 2 countries, within a single region. Go back. There we go. Alrighty, so on January 13th, a case in Thailand was found, and then in Japan on the 15th. So again, that's still within a smaller region of Asia. But then we go to phase 6 is where we are now, full-on pandemic, which is wide human spread infection, because a case was found and recorded on January 21st in the United States, and then following in France on the 24th. So we're no longer in a single isolated community, region, we're now across the globe. And we're still in that stage, and Dr. Fauci said this is where the world is really still negatively impacted by the pandemic. And then we go on to the post-peak is where we want to be. We're not there yet. We want to be there. So this is, okay, that's fine. So post-peak is disease levels in most countries drop below the observed levels. Alrighty, and so this is where, if you look at this slide here, this is the United States. So when it says it drops below observed levels, we look in February, it's nowhere near below the pattern we saw. So that's why we're still in this, we're still in phase 6 with the pandemic, because the cases have not come down. It's, in fact, they hit another high, and they seem to continue to hit highs. So this is where it's too premature to say, we can relax now, things are going back to normal, we're back to normal. So if you say that too prematurely, we let our guard down too far, which we kind of did. If we can be honest with ourselves, we did let our guard down some, because this is when a new variant can come and those cases spike back up, which we saw with the Delta variant as well as Omicron. And so Omicron is all up in that big hump over there. And so the next slide is just an example of the 1918 Spanish flu. And so there were 3 different waves. And to date, this is still the most severe pandemic in history. I have a quick slide showing the history of pandemics. But we see 3 distinct waves there. And it looks very similar to what we experienced during COVID-19. And so just a little bit of background about this, the Spanish flu was in 1918. This was when the United States entered World War I. And then this is when hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops traveled across the sea, right? So remember I said how interconnected we can be due to wars as well? So that's actually how the flu spread, is through these troops going all around the world. And they were taking the flu with them. And I'll come back to it as well, but that's exactly how smallpox wiped out almost 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas as well, when foreigners come to a new place and they bring stuff with them. And at the time, there was no vaccine for the flu. There was no modern medicine that could combat what was happening. So guess what they had to do? It's gonna sound a little bit familiar. Y'all can go ahead, take a guess what they had to do. Wear a mask, what else? Quarantine. Yeah, they quarantined, used good personal hygiene, disinfectants, isolations, and limited public gatherings. So it's not like what we're doing right now is new. Maybe some people didn't know, but this is what they had to do when there was no pharmaceuticals to help them out. And then finally, on to the post-pandemic. This is when there are normal levels outside of seasonal highs. So we think about seasonal highs, we think about flu season, right? So we know what flu season is. We know to protect ourselves. You know, people are doing their campaigns, get your flu shot, but it's normal life to us. And this is where we hope to get with COVID-19. But it's very important that surveillance continues to monitor the progress of the disease, so that way if there's something new, like a new variant that could threaten the normalcy that's being created, we're aware of it. And so the last part of a pandemic which is called elimination and eradication, which experts doubt will happen with COVID-19, just like the flu is just with us. You know, we're kind of used to it. It doesn't really phase us as much. The mortality rates aren't really as high for the flu. So it's just kind of like, oh, you know, it's the flu. COVID-19 is probably going to be very similar because elimination is when the presence of the disease is gone from a certain region. So we think about in the United States, we don't have a malaria problem. We just don't. But if you travel over to different parts of Asia and Africa, you have to take your malaria pills. Ask me, I know, and make sure you take it with food, okay? But then eradication is when it's global elimination. And to date, the records show the only disease that's been globally eliminated has been smallpox. So most diseases are still with us, even if it's in certain parts of the world. And so I'm gonna take you through the next couple of slides very quickly, because I don't want you to read it, but I want you to see the list of pandemics. And this isn't even all of them, these are kind of the major ones. And I just wanna point out a few things, because COVID-19 is the present one we're in, but the Black Plague or the Black Death or whatever you know it as, it wiped out 30% of Europe's population. So exactly, and at the time, again, they didn't have modern medicine. They had to use quarantine as well. And then we go on to cholera. We see cholera is going to come up quite a few times just because it was sanitation issues. It took a doctor to go shut down a water pump in London for them to understand the severity of the sanitation issues with cholera and how it was spreading. But that still affects different countries across the world. So you're going to see this first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh pandemic of cholera. And we can go on to the next slide. So there is more cholera, the Russian flu. You see cholera comes up quite a few times. We can go to the last history of pandemics. So of course we have AIDS, which is still ongoing because different parts of the world is still very much impacting the health and the lives of people there, killing 35 million people to date. And then we're down to COVID-19, which has killed about 5.7 million people worldwide. So yes, that's a lot of people. But if we look at the history, it could be worse. So we, praise God, we think that we're covered in the blood, that it's not worse for us. But yeah, this is not new to civilization, and it's going to continue that's how connected our worlds are. But we have to stay vigilant. And our last slide is what's next. So we're going to talk more about that on this panel tonight, but this is just a really interesting article that I found, and they suggest that, I don't want to say the end is near, but the end of the phenomenon is coming to the phenomenon is coming to an end where natural immunity as well as the vaccination immunity is going to be more prevalent, and the transmission should decrease, and I'll say the severity of the outcomes should decrease. And the last point is that after this Omicron wave, while COVID-19 will still be with us, they expect that the pandemic will not. So that we should be headed towards a post-pandemic phase. That's all I have for you tonight. We're going to go ahead and get into the discussion. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Josie, giving us some hope that we're nearing the end of this. So just to begin our panel discussion, Dr. Josie noted that in a global society, as this pandemic ends, we're going to still have to manage COVID. Our health systems are going to still have to do that. So I want to ask the first question to Dr. Wise. We know that COVID testing, vaccinations are part of how we manage COVID. And when we first started hearing about COVID, it was just COVID-19. She mentioned the Delta and the Omicron. Can you talk to us about what's the difference between these variants and why should we be concerned about them?
Okay, so the hallmark of a virus is that it changes over time. That process is called mutation. And the end result is a variant. So the reason why that's an issue is because as you have new variants develop, they can take on different characteristics from the original virus, which means that existing treatments or vaccines may become less effective over time. So there are certain variants of concern now. Delta and Omicron are the ones that we are most familiar with now. However, there are other variants of concern. The alpha, beta, and gamma variants are all being currently monitored. They are not being transmitted as readily, but they are still on the spectrum. One of the reasons why we want to make sure that we're monitoring these variants, specifically Delta and Omicron, because when Delta became most prevalent, the end of the summer going into the fall, it was much more transmissible and it was a more severe illness. The Omicron variant has now become the most prevalent variant, and thankfully it's a much more mild presentation, and our current existing treatments and therapies are still effective.
Thank you. So kind of related to that, so when we test for COVID, we find out if we're positive or negative. Why aren't we told like which variant that we might have?
So for the purpose of public health, when you've been exposed to someone with COVID and you're tested, we're looking to detect whether or not you have the virus that causes COVID-19 for the purposes of isolation and quarantine guidance. So once we have determined that, we can make decisions concerning your ability to spread it further. Now, from a health expert perspective, they will need to know which variant is circulating, because then overall public health guidance is going to be guided by that. So DHEC does have a public health lab, and it undergoes a process called whole genome sequencing, and that is actually the process to determine which variant is present. So DHEC has broken our state up into 4 different regions, and each day they take 12 samples from each region, so a total of 48 samples a day, and they undergo this whole genome sequencing to determine which variant it is, and every Friday DHEC uploads that information to their website. So that way you and I can go to see which variant is circulating in the area where we reside.
Thank you for clarifying that. So one of the main reasons we wanted to hold this town hall was to talk about children and vaccinations. And most pediatricians, physicians agree that, that COVID is generally mild for children. But on the other hand, there's a lot of recommendation for vaccination for children. So could you share your perspective on that?
So in general, yes, COVID is typically mild in children. However, we also know that children are going to interact with a broader spectrum of our society. So it's important for children to be vaccinated So not only, because although most instances are mild, there are instances that are not mild. We did see with especially the Delta variant, a higher hospitalization rate with children, a higher mortality rate with children. So it's important to protect our children from that perspective as well as overall public health, because they will continue to transmit the virus even if their presentation is mild. Those that are most vulnerable in the community may not have that same fate.
Thank you. And so you're a mom, I'm a mom. I actually happen to have a baby that's 2 years old, and we know now that at this point, everybody can be vaccinated except those under 5, but we know that that's about to change. So for those who may be nervous about it, can you give us some reassurance about the safety for our children when it comes to vaccination?
Yes. So currently, Pfizer will, as of February 1st, they submitted all their clinical trial data to the FDA. They filed an application requesting emergency use authorization in children 6 months to 4 years old. So on February 15th, that FDA advisory panel will meet, and they will make a determination based on safety and efficacy if the benefits of vaccinating this population will outweigh the risk. So that is coming up next week. After the FDA advisory panel gives their recommendation, the CDC advisory panel will then meet. FDA determines what, and the CDC determines who. So the CDC will determine who will get the vaccination, and once the CDC director has that information, she will produce a recommendation overall, and then distribution will begin. So what the information that has been compiled in those clinical trials have shown that especially with the Omicron variant circulating, the 2-dose series has not been as efficacious for the younger children. So it looks like that schedule will be a 3-dose series for those younger children. But ultimately, we'll know next Tuesday whether or not the FDA is going to recommend that.
Thank you. And I guess for the last, question for you as we move through the panel, can you give us any reasons why a child might not be appropriate, it may not be appropriate for them to be vaccinated, if they have allergies or anything like that?
Now, concerning the vaccine and allergies, if a child has a food allergy, that does not have any bearing on whether or not they're recommended to get the vaccine. If they've had a previous reaction to a vaccine, or especially if they've had a previous reaction to the first dose of their vaccine series, depending on what that reaction was, you'll want to make sure that you touch base with a pediatrician or family practitioner to give further guidance for that specific situation. So my children are vaccinated. I wanted to make sure that they were protected. Simply in our district, they didn't allow virtual education for elementary age children. So definitely it was an opportunity to provide the best level of protection that we could for our children.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wise, for your insights and those really great answers. Dr. Daniels, as a family physician, we know that you spend a lot of time with patients dealing with COVID, and we've been hearing about long-haul COVID. Could you tell us what is meant by the term COVID long haulers, and how do we know if you're at risk for that?
Yeah, so long-haul COVID is basically when you have symptoms greater than 4 weeks out from your original infection. So let's say you get an infection in June, you may have loss of taste of smell, cough, fever, and that may last for a couple of weeks. That's the normal progression of COVID. But if you're 4 weeks or more out, that's when you're in the long-haul COVID category. And it varies, and I've seen several of my patients that have had various symptoms. Long-haul COVID symptoms are primarily continued fatigue, persistent cough, what we call brain fog, where you can think about certain things, but your concentration is not quite where it needs to be. Chest pain. I've seen some cases of people with palpitations, so they maybe had issues where their heart was racing during COVID, but it just keeps happening over and over again. Memory issues is another big one as well. And then there's some mental health issues, chronic anxiety, depression. I've seen some cases of individuals who had no history of anxiety or depression, but they just were dealing with this continuous issue with depression and anxiety. This is the issue with long-haul COVID, and this is why it's so important. Anyone who gets COVID can develop long-haul symptoms. Anyone can. In fact, you can have very mild symptoms of the actual disease, and then after that 4-week period of time, develop some of the symptoms that I just described. Most people who develop long-haul COVID are sicker. They may have been hospitalized, a longer progression of the disease, even if they managed it at home. But anyone can, including kids. Thankfully, most people won't develop it, but we're estimating that about 14 to 30 million Americans will deal with long-haul COVID, which will range from a few weeks to several months. Long-haul COVID is so important that you guys have heard of the American Disabilities Act, right? That determines long-haul COVID is now classified as an ADA disability. So people are going to be able to apply for disability based on their long-haul COVID symptoms. So if they've designated it, that means the government knows this is an issue that we're going to be dealing with for some years. So just want to make sure you guys know that. So.
Wow, that was very insightful. Thank you. So currently, what are the COVID guidelines and why they seem to change a lot, and a lot of people seem unsure about what to do. What is it that we should be looking to? Who should we trust?
Yeah, good question. I hate that the guidelines change all the time, because then I have to make sure I'm giving the right information out to my patients. So the reason why the guidelines change is because we are learning how to manage the disease as we go. So it's live. These things change over time, and so that's why the guidelines change. There's political issues behind the guidelines. So even with the Omicron variant, because we studied it and figured out, well, it's not as virulent, it's not as bad as Delta. However, it was causing a lot of people to be out of work. Then they had to look at, all right, can we really have most of the population who gets this out 14 days and still keep our economy going? So they had to look at what is the smallest window that we can make recommendations for when you can be out of work. So that's why you guys probably noticed they shortened it down, especially for healthcare workers, to a 5 to 7 day recommendation. So that's a part of the reason why the guidelines change. Most of the guidelines that have changed are based on good science. So it's just one of those things that we have to get adjusted to, because there will be more guidelines coming out about yearly vaccinations in COVID. There's some new medicines coming out to treat that will treat COVID. Just like if you get the flu, you guys may know of a 5-day pill you can take to lessen your symptoms. There's going to be a medicine that comes out like that. The guidelines will change as well. So next couple of years that will happen, and then eventually we'll have some good solid evidence, and the guidelines will then at that point likely stay pretty stable.
Thank you for that one. You also mentioned about the shrinking window of time for quarantine.
Right.
How long does the individual, or do you know individuals, is contagious? Does that make sense?
Right, yes, that's a great question. So for most people who get COVID, you're contagious a day before you actually start having symptoms. Wow. To about 5 to 7 days after, okay? Mm-hmm. With the Delta variant, you could be contagious up to 11 days out, but for most people, it's about a 5 to 7 day window. Now, you can still shed the virus, you can go get a test, and you can still have a positive test, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're infectious. For the Omicron variant, most people are very, very virulent within like 2-3 days. That's why you may have heard of patients, or someone who they go to a family gathering, 5-6 people get the infection within a week. Everybody in the family is okay because it's just so contagious. But in general, 1 week is about the average for most of the variants.
And the last question, I want to take us back to the post-COVID syndrome. So at what point should someone be concerned about post-COVID syndrome and seeking out help of a healthcare professional?
Yeah, usually about 30 to 60 days out, you should be concerned about it. And this is a quick note I want to make about this as well. If you're still having symptoms from COVID, make sure you seek help and don't let people tell you that it's all in your head. Long haul COVID is real. I had a patient that I'm taking care of right now who's developed this stuttering issue.
Wow.
So I had to go back and research, and there's cases of stuttering related to it. And so we're managing that. So that's the first thing. If you're still having symptoms, don't ignore them because they are real, okay? After that 30 to 60 day period of time, make sure to seek care for it, because right now, primarily, we're managing the symptoms and allowing the long haul COVID symptoms to just work its way through. Most of it's related to inflammation in the body. That's why most of these symptoms exist. And fortunately, what I've seen in my practice is that for the most part, they do get better. So that's one of the good things about it. They do get better, but make sure you're monitored. I brought up that disability issue because I have two patients who they couldn't work anymore, and I made sure that I regularly monitored them so that they could take advantage of some of those benefits that were out there until they could get back into the workforce. That's why you want to make sure it's documented if you're having those symptoms, so that if you have to get something short term, you're able to do that. But if you stay at home, don't seek care, 4 or 5 months goes by, and now you say, oh, I've got long haul COVID, it may be an issue. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We actually have a question I think that would be good for you, Dr. D. Is there anything that's recommended for an asthmatic who has recently recovered from COVID?
Yeah, so COVID tends to cause flare-ups of asthma or even new onset asthma, which means you didn't have asthma before you get COVID and now you have symptoms. There are a lot of inhalers out there that have inhaled steroids, and one's Flovent is one that you may have heard of, Advair. There are some good studies that show that those help decrease inflammation in the lungs, so I would check with your doctor and see if you can get on an inhaled steroid, Flovent, Advair, something of that nature. Your doctor will know about that, and it seems to help.
Thank you. And one additional question that came in from the live audience: is there a correlation with increased allergies and COVID-19 being in the atmosphere?
Increased allergies like in the atmosphere? No, there's not really a relationship because it's viral, so whether the allergy level in the environment is high or low, the virus is still gonna, do what it does.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniels. So now we want to build from what's been shared about COVID, vaccinations, long-haul complications, and come full circle to talk about how this is impacting the mental health of our children and families. Pastors Chandler and Pastor Katie, you're both parents, you're pastors, and you both counsel families. So either one of you can answer first, but how can parents support children who are going to school during the pandemic?
I think one of the biggest ways that parents can support their kids is talking to them and doing more than just saying, how was your day? And letting them say good and thinking that that's enough. Kind of explore with them if there were any changes to their day, because the pandemic has brought about a lot of changes that happen suddenly. And just exploring with them how they feel about it, and even kind of normalizing with them that some of the changes that are happening can be frustrating for you too, and to talk to them about how they are coping with some of those changes. Some kids, if they start at kindergarten, like in 2020, they don't even know what normal school really is like. Some of them haven't been on field trips. Some of them don't get to sit in the cafeteria with their friends. We have 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds having to social distance while in school. And so that can be very draining for a kid because they have to have self-control and really think about that kind of stuff. And so talk to your kids about that. And like I said, normalize that the changes are a lot so that you can talk to them about the coping skills that you use that are healthy. Because the thing that I notice a lot is if we don't talk to our kids about healthy coping skills, they will find coping skills and they may not be the best coping skills. And so, and kids don't always talk to you. So you got to kind of get in their world, get in their room, especially parents, if you have teenagers. Don't just let the awkwardness of them looking, giving you kind of like the death stare of why are you in here? Why are you talking to me? Keep at it. Keep talking to them. When they say good, well, what was good about your day? Tell me what was good. How is that class? How is so-and-so your friend? You know, keep talking to them. And I think that is one of the biggest ways that parents can support them in school. And another way is to stay in constant communication with the teachers. Asking them, have they seen any changes with your child and their behavior? And also checking on the teachers, you know, because teachers are going through a whole lot. I have a friend that's a teacher, and I just called to ask her one thing, and she just broke down and started crying about something totally different. So teachers are under a lot of pressure also. So just checking in and staying in constant communication with the teachers and with your child, I think is the best way to support them.
That's great.
I would like to address that too. That's so good, Pastor Katie. In my field of work and my assignment in Youth Ministry Church, a lot of what I do is I blend things like what Pastor Katie just mentioned. I blend it in my field. I have to do the studying and then blend it with the supernatural. And so I would like to add quality there. And so when I was first seeing all this go down with our students, and even being a parent, seeing what's going on with my kids, and then even having relationships with coaches and having a relationship with some teachers, I was like, Lord, this is overwhelming. Like, how do we do this? Where's the front line of this type of battle? And one thing comes to mind about James 2:18. He says, you know, you have faith, but I'll show you my faith by my works. And I was like, this is going to require a lot of things we need to do. So I started blending information with prayer life. And one of the prayer points we have in our youth ministry right now during this climate is dealing with young people's anxiety. And what I've seen so much is that there could be young people who know they're dealing with anxiety, and then you have that 11-year-old and that 12-year-old who can't really articulate what's going on. So as a parent, you got to pay attention to signs and signals, and you can't be moved. The biggest thing that's hard now with parenting, what I found out with paying attention to the signs and the ramifications of this pandemic, is these headphones, these video games, and these devices. You can literally think everything's fine with your child, and it's not. And so what I've realized is that we got to dig in, and it requires so much intentionality as a parent. But the good part is we're Christians, we're believers. And this is where our faith is so essential. And so what I would say is this: maximize your prayer life, but also blend it with intellectualism, blend it with practical data, blend it with information. I wrote this down, data with dunamis determination. And so what I realized is that every time I heard feedback from what Dr. Daniels and his studies on previous town halls, and even Pastor Katie, seeing some of the posts that she had online with mental health, I, as a youth pastor, would grab so much of that information, get with our youth workers and say, how can we make these prayer points? What are you hearing about? We're so blessed in our youth ministry to have so many different youth workers who work in the school system. We have educators, and like you said, I had one youth worker just protecting this individual. They broke down and cried because of things that were going on with other teachers and their coworkers. Once again, where's the frontier? Where do we fight? Do I focus on the student? Do I focus on the adult? So parents, hang in there and stay focused on your teens and stay focused on your young people during this time.
Thank you both. From what both of you are saying, you know, I say Jesus and skills. Both are necessary. And if you both can follow up on kind of the coping skills, any suggestions of things that we might try, especially as you were talking about connecting with your children, trying to get behind those headphones, you know, what are some things that we can do as parents?
Well, first, because I thought about something else too as a way that you can support your children. If your child is truly struggling, like they are truly struggling with anxiety or they are truly struggling with depression, and it is impacting them across the board, one of the things a lot of parents don't know, I think, is available is something called a 504 plan. If they are seeing a mental health professional and there is a diagnosis, attached to what is going on with them or something that is documented that they are dealing with, you can reach out to that mental health professional and tell them, I would like you to write a letter. You'd have to sign a release and all that stuff to my kid's guidance counselor or administration, explaining that, saying that I see this child, they have a diagnosis, these are the symptoms of it, and these are some suggested accommodations for that child. A lot of times we think of an IEP, which is like intellectual accommodations, but if there is documented that they are dealing with depression or anxiety, which anxiety has went through the roof with adolescents, teens, period, you can request that meeting, and they'll have a meeting, and if your therapist is willing, they can attend that meeting also with you. But it is a way to kind of advocate also for your child who may be kind of getting lost. I recently did one and had a girl, her father passed away. It's COVID, so her father passed away. So she was dealing with a lot of grief, and she would be sitting in class crying and nobody would do anything. She's supposed to be doing her work and nobody's doing anything. Well, I kind of talked to her mom, have you heard of this? You need to get this kind of in place with the school. Like, what's a plan? If she's sitting there and she's dealing with this, what is the plan? Where does she go? Who does she go talk to? So I think that is also something.
It's so essential as parents that we remain clear and calm. So when it comes to coping, I realize like being clear with your young person and calm, it makes the world of difference. Now, the tough part about this pandemic is while we're parenting, we're still dealing with bills, we're still dealing with potentially issues in our marriages, and we're still dealing with other things that come in with work and different desires that we're working on as adults, right? But when it comes to that young person, pausing your world and zooming in on their world and realizing that that is a real world. It's not that they have a little world that's less important than ours, and that when they grow up, they're in a big world. They're in a real world. And so in our household, one of the things that my wife and Idrea have went ahead and moved forward with this is we realize that being the faith-based parents of these times to help our children cope is we are mixing therapy and theology. God is requiring both in our home. Never than ever before, like this whole notion of you're going through something wrong if you have to go to therapy, or you're not a person of faith if you're going through therapy, or you're not a powerful Christian if you need counseling. I'll be transparent. My son, when this thing first went down, he was more moved by the social injustice issues combined with the issues that were going on in school. Keep in mind, my son is not 16, 17 years old, 18. He's in the junior age of 11 and 10 at the time. And so we prayed about it. And as a parent, we talked to him. We were very clear about what was going on in the schools. We were calm. The only reason why we were calm is because we have a prayer life. Once again, I believe I'm addressing prayerful parents. And I pray you are operating in a high prayer culture in your home. Not unlike any time before, your prayer culture in your home has to be at an all-time high. Don't let your church be a church of prayer and your home be lost without it. And so prayer is at an all-time high, but God led us to do therapy. So we took our son into therapy. He came out, had a chance to express himself. Here's another thing. You have to be okay and realize you're not a bad parent, that your child feels better when they talk to someone else. So for us, coping was releasing other resources to our kids. He came back, felt better, felt lighter, was able to go back and just handle things, had a better understanding that the world's not perfect. Felt like it was a lot of the things I already said, but hey, it worked. So coping for young people, from what I've seen and what I even heard from some parents, remaining clear and calm. Now that means we can't lie to them. We can't be like Disney World and say it may not be okay, but here's the faith part, but God can make sure you're okay. Amen. And so you have to be comfortable blending both conversations. And when you do that in a calm way and you're clear with your young person, I believe that'll lead them down the right path when it comes to coping.
Just to piggyback off something you just said, it's so very important to model what it is you want to see your kids do. And when we model two different things, and what I mean is, like you said, let the church be a house of prayer. So when they see you one way at church, and then they see you another way at home, like you're very friendly and engaging at church, but they sit in their room and you don't come in to talk to them and you don't come in to see them, they end up resenting the church. That is what happens. I have kids that I see, that I talk to on a regular basis, and they resent certain things because they're like, but they can do it. They do talk, but they don't talk to me. And so be very mindful that we're not modeling two different things. Also, like Pastor Chandler said, being very honest on a age-appropriate level, tell them about your struggles. I talk to my girls all the time about things that I dealt with when I was in the 9th grade or when I was in the 7th grade, so that they understand, like, this is natural. Normalize for them issues. It's not that you'll stay there. It's not that you're a bad person. I tell my kids all the time, everything is not always going to go your way. I tell them all the time, every day is not going to be a parade of people marching down the streets saying your name and in your honor. That's just not reality. But what happens as parents, we do want to protect them and we don't want to see them go through things. And so we don't normalize how do you confront issues? How do you confront a challenge? How do you cope? And so what happens, they don't say anything and they're trying to figure it out on their own. And like I said earlier, if you don't help them develop healthy coping skills, they will develop coping skills. It just may not be healthy ones.
Wow, I feel like we're in church right now. I forgot I got to help moderate this conversation. So I want to build off something that you said, Pastor Katie, and you, Pastor Chandler, about therapy. So during the pandemic, there are now more opportunities for therapy, especially even virtually. Can you talk about that? And, does it work as well as in person?
I think that as far as virtual therapy versus in-person therapy, it kind of depends on the person and the personalities. Some people, I have clients I've never met in person. They're from another part of South Carolina, and we just log on and go. It's great. I have noticed doing virtual therapy sometime with children is a little rough. You're trying to talk about something and they take their iPad and they are running through the house and you're like, no, go back. So I think it depends on the personality, the age, all of those kind of things that will determine if, someone is better for virtual therapy or face-to-face therapy.
I just want to comment and say I agree wholeheartedly with what Pastor Katie said. As I really believe the age is the strategy. But one thing to encourage any parent out there streaming right now in our church or in here, and you're a little skeptical about okay, I'm nervous. I wanted to focus on faith only. No, we got some scriptures for that. We don't need to do no therapy. I want to encourage you and say this. If confusion can get into your child through a screen, clarity can too. And so be encouraged to give it a try. And so if the devil can come into these kids and get them off through YouTube and through a small little slide commercial, how much more can just that one step towards practical solutions encourage your kid and even help them cope during these times?
So I guess before we move to the live Q&A, I just want to ask one additional question, because both of you were talking about the role of parents in helping our kids get through this pandemic. What advice do you have for parents who may be dealing with anxiety themselves? It's difficult to help your children, when the parent is kind of going through themselves.
Okay, I can jump in this one first. When I was thinking about today and anything I was going to say, I wrote this down. Fighting for your child's mind is fighting for their life. And I wrote, Mom and Dad, keeping your mind makes you fit for the fight of their lives. And so I believe, to answer your question, that we're in a place of dealing with reality. There's no way I can separate my world from my kids' world no more. There's no way I can act like we're dealing with different things. And so if I look at it like this, if I'm in a plane, the flight attendant instructs us to grab the mask first, right? And make sure you have yours on, and then you're sober-minded enough, because you have what you need, to place what they need on them. And I believe for us as parents, it's so important that we're asking ourselves and being really reflective and coming to true realization, am I okay? What's going on? If you have a spouse, bounce questions off your spouse. Honey, am I acting a little crazy during these times? Or whatever you might want to say. If it comes out in a joke, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. But whatever you have to say to make yourself, ask yourself, am I okay? How are my nerves? What's on my mind? What thoughts am I having? How's my ability to get up and keep moving and go? And because the truth be told, it's going to be so much more. And I know Pastor Katie could probably answer this question with more tips for you all. But it's going to be so much harder for you as a parent to encourage your child to get up and go and move forward in life if you do not even know where to start when it comes to your world with moving forward in life.
That was great. I think one of the things that you can do as a parent is, one, seek help if you need it. Number two, what do you do to relax? What do you do to unplug? I think as parents, we work all day, we have all these different responsibilities, and we go straight from that into picking up somebody from rehearsal or practice, and I gotta cook, and I gotta do this, and I gotta do that, and I gotta do this, and then I gotta do this. I think one of the things as a parent is to realize I will always have something to do. So the issue is not I will rest when I don't have anything to do, because I will always have something to do. So once I realize I will always have something to do, I just schedule in the time to rest, to take a break. Even teach your kids when you need a moment, and it's okay. So like when my kids were younger, I would go in my room and maybe I'd take a bubble bath, and I'd do it for like 10 or 15 minutes, but I'd play certain music. And my girls knew that when they heard this music, unless it is an emergency, do not interrupt me. And so I made a special point that when that time was up, I'd go and check on them, because I didn't want them to feel like, oh, I just can't talk to her. But they knew if they heard that, like, okay, I'm a chill, she needs a moment. Even now, I'll tell them I need a moment. Sometimes sitting in your car, before you get out, and because kids do not respect the fact you've been to work all day. They do not. I mean, I hate to say, I'm not going to say they don't care. They just do not respect it. I know you're tired, but this is what I need, though. This is what I got at school today. I need this for my project. And so learning how to take those small moments just to unplug, getting to know your interest. I counsel a lot of adults that don't know what they like. I'm like, well, what do you like to do? I don't know. Well, if you don't know what to do, guess what you're doing? I bet your kids don't know what they like either. So now they're going to grow up and they're not going to know what they like to do, and they're not going to know how to do these things to unwind and relax also. And so I think those things are very important, but really getting to know yourself and being open to maybe trying new things. I've sat with adults that I say, what do you do to relax? And they'll be like, I play this game on my phone. I'm like, what? Like, no, that's not, like, unplug. Like, what do you do that you could do it and you're not even thinking? So a lot of people just don't know that. And so if you don't know those things, kind of explore it with yourself and figure out what it is that gives you downtime and do it.
Well, thank y'all so much for the insight. We know that the mental health is really a big deal, and then we all have been impacted in some way as a result of COVID. So I just want to run to a couple of the live questions or questions that were submitted, and then we will wrap things up. So these are kind of, I think, Dr. D, these are questions I think can be posed to you. So does the shot put the spike protein into your body?
No, it doesn't. So what the shot does is it allows your own immune system to create antibodies that you make against the spike protein that's on the virus, right? So it's basically, it just mimics the protein, And then your immune system says, oh, there's an invader there. I gotta boost up my immune system to fight it. So they're called neutralizing antibodies. So when the virus comes in, your immune system reacts and kills the virus, but it doesn't put it into your body.
And I think along with that, can you also speak to these, comments about it also impacting your DNA?
Right. Yeah, I've had a lot of interesting conversations about that. So, all right. So it's just a little biology lesson here. So everybody knows, you've heard of a protein, right? So your body has all these proteins in it. And the way your body makes proteins is that your DNA makes something called mRNA, messenger RNA, right? It's like a code. And then once your body makes this mRNA, the DNA is done. It's done with that mRNA. And then the mRNA makes protein for whatever you need. So if you need an increase of muscle in your body, DNA tells mRNA makes protein, and the proteins do their work, right? The vaccine is an mRNA. Okay, it has no DNA in it. And so basically what it does is it causes, when you get the vaccine, it causes your body to make the proteins that causes your immune system to react to it. So you can't go backwards. So protein can't make mRNA, can't make DNA. It all starts with DNA. So if you have an mRNA, it can never go this way. It has to go this way. Does that make sense? So when it's literally impossible for that. The other thing is this: mRNA doesn't last in your system a long time. Your DNA is there for the rest of your life. But when it makes that mRNA, once the mRNA does its job, it just dissolves in your system. Same thing with the vaccine. Once it does its job, it's gone. So it can never interact back with the DNA. And that's sort of why it's impossible for that to happen.
Thank you for clarifying that. So I hope everybody's taking good notes so you can share that with your family members at your next dinner.
So I have one question from the audience, and it's actually a really good one because I hear this a lot. What causes one person to test negative and then another person living in the same house to test positive?
Yes, that's a great question. So it depends on a couple of things. How much time were you exposed to that person that was positive, right? So we feel like if you, say with Omicron, if you were in direct exposure for about 15 to 20 minutes where you weren't masked, they weren't masked, and you inhaled that, you could be exposed. But if you were separate from that person, then you may be negative if they tested positive. So it has to do with that, your proximity to that person. Did they have symptoms? Were they coughing? Those are some of the things that, and then a lot of that has to do with vaccination as well. So say both of the people are vaccinated or one person isn't, the vaccinated person may not have any symptoms at all or may not contract it depending on their vaccination status.
Thank you.
And I guess one final question is, why are they not letting doctors attend their patients to, is it ivermectin and hydrochloroquine?
Oh, right. Okay, so you guys remember Trump talked about hydrochloroquine, and that happened. I'm like, oh my God, my job just got 100 times harder. This is going to be a mess. So when that happened, a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon about hydrochloroquine. And that's, the reason is because it does fight certain parasites, okay? With ivermectin, which came on the scene recently in the past year, there was a lot of data out there or suggestion that doctors said, hey, this may work. So we're all trying to research these different things. In the past year, and time has really helped us out, there have been 20 different studies on hydrochloroquine, right? And some Germans actually looked at these studies, so this is outside of our country, and they basically found that hydroxychloroquine, although it's probably not unsafe, it really does not prevent COVID or treat COVID adequately after the data came out. So when it first came out, I mean, as a physician, I'm trying to figure out how can I take care of my patients I tried it on a few patients to see if it helped them or not. So, and then when the data came out, I'm like, okay, it's not working. I mean, it's not going to help patients, so I didn't do that. With ivermectin, the same issue came up, and they did studies in the hospital. People were in the outpatient setting, in other words, coming to the clinic, and for prevention. And in those studies, it showed some people may have got worse on the ivermectin, but we don't really know why, okay? So what happens with that is these medicines have what we call label use. So they were studied years ago for disease A, B, and C. So when you use it outside of what the FDA mandates, it's what we call off-label, which means as a physician, if you use it off-label, you better really know that you think it helps someone, because if it hurts them, that's not a good situation. So that's why they mandated, hey, these don't work. We're encouraging physicians not to use it if they don't think because we don't think there's a benefit. Now, maybe some studies will come out to show that, but until they do, we want to be as safe as possible. As physicians, we have a motto: at first, do no harm. We want to help people and not harm them. I kind of want to dovetail on that, because there's one thing I want to mention to make sure I get out that we do believe may help individuals from having severe disease, and that's vitamin D supplementation. And there's some really good studies that show that people who are vitamin D deficient and get COVID, they tend to get sicker. The other reason I'm bringing this up is that 80% of African Americans are vitamin D deficient. And we know that from some pretty good studies. So it's a good idea, find out your vitamin D status, and then supplement. So I have some of my patients doing between 2,000 to 5,000 international units. So find that out and supplement if you need it. The cutoff number is 20. If your vitamin D level is below 20, you need to supplement. There's an Israeli study that just came out that showed there was some benefit. It doesn't keep you from getting COVID. It helps your own immune system fight COVID if you happen to be exposed.
I think this last question will do a great job of finishing us out. Will we ever get to a place when masking and social distancing will be a thing of the past?
Yes, I believe that will be the case. So what will happen, as Dr. Josie mentioned about the progression of the disease, once we get through this Omicron phase, a lot of researchers are pretty sure we're going to go into what's called an endemic phase. So it'll be like the flu. And when we have low levels of the virus in the population, then it's much more likely that you can not mask or have to worry as much about social distancing, because it's just less of a chance you get it. At the peak of Omicron, right, the percent positive rate, that means the percentage positive in our community, was almost 40%, okay? Once it gets under 3% in the community, that's when we can start to relax with some of those things. And so what will happen in the future is the levels will be low, we'll be able to relax things. Researchers, epidemiologists, people who research this will track this virus, just like they do the flu. And when there's a spike, or hopefully there won't be, but if it acts like the flu, which it likely will, then they'll say, hey, these numbers are going up. That's when we go back to social distancing, masking, things of that nature for that period of time. And that's likely how we'll have to do things probably over the next couple of years. But we will get to not having to mask as much. And I know if you're like me, I'll be so glad when I don't have to wear a mask, especially in the exam room. So.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for joining us, both in the sanctuary as well as our virtual audience. We hope you've been blessed today from the information that was shared. And we hope that you take these things back and share them with your family and friends and coworkers. And this time, I would like to turn over to Pastor Chandler so he can close us out in prayer.
Can I say one last thing?
Sure.
Because there was a question that didn't get addressed. There was a live question about what the church is doing, our church, RDCI, in terms of our policies for COVID. Now, I mean, I'm not trying to toot our church's horn, but we've done a really, really great job with managing this, and it has to do with our leadership first, right? So thank God for that, really, really. I've had multiple conversations with Bishop, Pastor Marsha through this whole process. So as you can see, we've got our chairs separated out. We encourage masking, and shout out to everybody. You guys have done a great job with masking when you're coming up. That's a very responsible thing to do. And we're continuing to monitor it. So that's why you may see a shift every once in a while where we say, hey, kids can't be on now because we got to make a change. We're looking at the numbers of where they need to be. And everybody's been great with adjusting for that. But think about it. We have not had a major outbreak in this church since this pandemic has happened. We had some small ones, but we have not had a major outbreak. So I say that just to encourage everybody. Look, we got to come back to church at some point, right? And we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. But I get concerned about if we get in this rut of not coming to church, we're really missing out on what God wants to do in the sanctuary. So just be assured we're on it. We're working together as a team to keep you safe.